Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Before we get started, I'd like to give a big shout-out to our new patron, Beverly Nix. Thank you for supporting us and helping to defray the costs of putting on the show. An American woman is studying Christmas movies for her PhD at the bar. An English guy and a Scottish guy walk in. You may think this is a setup for a punchline, but it's not. It's actually the unlikely composition of co-hosts for the Impressions of America podcast. My guest today is the American woman, Vaughn Joy, who is seriously, and I mean hyper-focused seriously, studying Christmas movies during the Cold War era for historical clues and their meanings. If history is a comic book store, then Vaughn is a comic book geek, which she actually is, scouring the magazine racks for evidence of hidden clues and the meanings behind them. After talking to Vaughn, I have come to appreciate the complex workings of her brilliant, nuanced mind. A mind in which she uses her own personal life as yeast for her growing repertoire of academic work. Oh, but I do get lost in the metaphors. Vaughn Joy, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we just get right down into the rabbit hole, and I'm going to ask you the question. And the question, of course, is what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
So I have thought a lot about this question. The truest answer is anything and everything to do with how people live their lives in the past, particularly with entertainment history and how people pass time. I'm fascinated by it. So all of my research up to now really focuses on some element of how people understand the world around them and how they process the world around them and how they escape from the world around them. As a kid, I wasn't really interested in history because I thought it was kind of diplomatic history. I thought that was the extent of it, diplomats and military history, and it just wasn't really for me. I really loved social studies, though, and I would spend hours upon hours sitting at my great-grandparents' feet and listening to them talk about their experiences in World War II and the immediate kind of post-war period, starting their family. I'm fascinated by how people lived in previous times. So I think my favorite history is that of just ordinary, everyday people and how they got on with their lives.
And that kind of spills over into the work that you've done, too, looking at the post-war, your PhD. Tell me about your PhD again.
So I am studying Christmas films from the early Cold War period, 1946 to 1961. And I'm looking at them for how they reflect and refract, how they inform and influence American culture in that immediate post-war period. My project starts in 1946 with It's a Wonderful Life by Frank Capra, Jimmy Stewart, Donna Reed, and it runs through Miracle on 34th Street from 1947, White Christmas in 1954, and caps off in 1961 with Babes in Toyland from Disney. and Pocketful of Miracles, which is a lesser-known Frank Capra film. I'm exploring things that some people would think are probably mundane or not really important areas of these films, including how people shopped in the stores or how consumers are represented in these films, how department stores are represented in these films, and what that can say about the wider experiences of Americans during the Cold War, or in fact, the early part of the Cold War, especially through the 1950s as the quote-unquote age of affluence and conspicuous consumption. How does that change across the films? And these kind of minor points, I find them quite important. I think they have a lot to say about the pressures on Hollywood to produce reflective media and influence a sort of message that Hollywood wants to get across, or the people influencing Hollywood want Hollywood to influence and get across in this period. In 1947, right at the start of my 15-year period, we have the start of the HUAC investigations, the House Committee on Un-American Activities in Hollywood, to rout out communists. And that in November 1947, immediately after the first subpoenas in the Hollywood 10, refusing to testify to Congress, that is the start of the blacklist that runs through 1960. So almost all of the breadth of my project is influenced by the blacklist and government kind of pressures on Hollywood to be creating American media. So my question really is, how can you present American media in a genre or a subgenre, being Christmas films, that is so innocent and innocuous that you wouldn't be expecting to see this kind of political messaging? It's a genre that's deemed non-political. But my take is that I don't believe non-political art exists. I think all art is interpretive and influences somebody's politics, even by just presenting an American person. What you choose to represent them with is a political decision of who an American, an archetypal American, is. So those are all of the kinds of things that I'm questioning in my PhD.
Wow, it's all like breadcrumbs that people have left, and you're looking for them. That's cool. I love it. I just listened to also the Christmas episode where you talk a little bit about your PhD. I know that you're not British. I know that, but I lived in England. I went to grad school for a semester, and I lived in London. And so I'm like total Anglophile. So I ended up wearing my British. I usually try to dress up for the interview somehow with my Union Jack. But the other thought I had was to dress up, like wear an ugly sweater or something, because I know you love Christmas.
Yes.
And I can't do that, because when I was having my treatments for the thing I have, I was wearing these ugly sweaters every day, and I was being like ugly Christmas, and I was like, I can't do that. So yeah, you live in London, that's right. How did you end up there?
So this is kind of crazy. My research has gone through so many different phases because I'm interested in just kind of everything. Like I said at the start, just how people live their lives. And that covers a huge umbrella. So I'm from Philadelphia originally. I grew up just outside of it, and then I went to undergrad in Philadelphia at LaSalle University. And I did 2 bachelors at the same time. I did one in early American history and one in classical languages. And then I kind of rolled the dice to see which one I wanted to go to grad school for. And on the back of my Greek textbook that I was using that year, it had a little bio about the author, and it said that he went to Trinity College Dublin. And I was like, I'm going to go there. So I applied on a whim, didn't think I'd actually get in. and got into Dublin, and I got into another school in the States, and financially it made more sense. It was cheaper for me to move to Dublin than to stay for university in the States. So I did a master's in classics, and I wrote about demonology.
Yes. I was going to ask you about that. I have a note about that.
So I have multiple chronic pain conditions. I have endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome, and then some other things as well. And that has become a very important part of my life to explore and understand and research. And the ancients actually had a word for endometriosis, which was very surprising to me because today's doctors don't know much about endometriosis. So the fact that the Greeks were about on par with modern technology in women's healthcare was really striking for me. So I dug into that a little more, and my thesis was on mental escapism for women who had reproductive diseases in the ancient world. And the way they escaped from them was by creating myths about demonesses who would attack women's reproductive areas. So that thesis looks at all of the literary and mythical references of these demonesses and their attacks, and then maps those onto the symptom profiles from early medical texts, like the Hippocratics and Soranus and Galen. And that was a really important project for me to kind of connect with these people who have this disease that I have. And I was diagnosed with it at 16. I've had it for about a decade, or I've been diagnosed with it for about a decade. And it's been a struggle for me because some of my doctors don't understand it. I've had upwards of 30 specialists in the last 10 years. And I've had about 7 surgeries, and it's a very big part of my life. It's chronic pain. I mean, you can't really avoid it. So getting to process all of that on my own while working through translations of women making it make sense for them in the same way that I had to do as a teenager. Yeah. It was just a very personal and important project for me.
That is so cool, because like the sense I'm getting is that you were connecting with those women in ancient times.
It was pretty cool. Deeply personal and very, very interesting to be able to just kind of see that these struggles aren't new, that people for centuries have had to deal with very just human things, and make it make sense to them.
Right. It seems like you are constantly doing that with the work you're doing.
I love the process of understanding the world. And that is what actually brought me to London. After I finished that master's in classics, I kind of fell out of love with classics. I love translating, and I still translate Latin and Greek sometimes for fun, but I don't do it for work. I know, for fun. I don't do it for work anymore. And I had just kind of fallen out of love with the process of classical research because it's very different from historical research. So one of my professors at Trinity, I was talking to her through all of this, and she said that she did her PhD at UCL, University College London, where I'm now studying. And it was just kind of an offhanded remark. She was like, oh, if you want me to write to someone there, like, we can see if you can get in. And I was like, oh, cool, I'll go to UCL. So I applied, didn't think I'd get in, ended up doing a master's there. And my supervisor during my master's asked if I would stay on. When I told him I was interested in doing a PhD, he asked if we could work together. And now we are working on Christmas films. And that master, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ooh and ah. That's what I do. People talk to me and I ooh and ah. And it's genuine. And I usually have to edit out a lot of the, oh, wow, that's cool. Oh, amazing. So just know that it's coming from my heart.
That master's in is in history, just broadly. And I really was torn on that one too, about what I would focus on, because I started it wanting to study music. I'm a massive Beatles fan, like an absurd Beatles fan.
Oh, well, you're in the right place.
And I wanted to write about the Beatles. I actually also applied to University of Liverpool, but ended up coming to UCL instead. I really wanted to study that. But I had come across a comic book about the goddess Venus. And the comic book is from 1948, in the immediate post-war period. And my curiosities about the post-war period kind of peaked, because I hadn't worked specifically with that period before. My undergraduate thesis was on comics and cartoons that that represented racism towards South Asian communities from 1920 through World War II. So I had studied early 20th century, but I was really kind of fascinated with this post-war period, and it reminded me of my grandparents, my great-grandparents. So I started digging into that comic book, and I realized I could connect it to the masters that I just finished and kind of bring this new love for classics back in by reading it as a classical reception piece, of bringing the classics, bringing this goddess of Venus into the modern world, and what those associations with the classic representations and iconography of Venus can mean for the people in the comic book interacting with Venus and the people reading it in modern day America in 1948. So that thesis was a lot of fun. I got to read a lot of comics for it. And it really reflects a lot of attitudes towards gender norms in New York in 1948, just through how Venus is changed from her classical representations and how they interpret some of the mythology that surrounds Venus. You get a sense of the kind of cultural implications for New York in 1948 around a goddess. And it was a very interesting kind of research area.
It's interesting how it bridges out to what you're doing now. It goes from the classics. Yeah, that's interesting, the trajectory of your studies.
Yeah, it's all just kind of waterfalled together and exploring different things. Yeah. And that was another thing for me about this kind of escapism from the modern world and how people process life, because I was a comic book kid. I still am. I read a lot of comics. And thinking about how people consume their entertainment and their media, how kids read comic books today, it's a fascinating thing for me to think. There was a kid reading this comic book and getting their own ideas 60 or so years ago, 70 years ago, I guess. And it just, I don't know, there's something about just kind of connecting with someone in the past, reading the same thing they would have read, and trying to picture yourself in this previous time. How would you have consumed this media? Or why would you consume this? Why are kids reading about a goddess in 1948? I don't know. That's most of the driving force.
Yeah, no, I'm armchair historians. I'm not a historian. I dabble in history. I do tours. I've curated exhibits, things like that. I just love to talk about history, and I don't talk about it like you guys on your podcast. You're all incredibly intelligent, but the thing that I like about it is that I understand what you're talking about. And sometimes I think that historians tend to make history like there's a sense of ownership and gatekeepership, and I've always felt locked out of it. I like the energy that comes from the dialogue of people who are passionate about history wherever they're from. I've interviewed historians. I've interviewed, YouTube celebrities. I like the energy that comes from it and the passion. And what I like about your studies is that what I'm hearing you say is there's not that wall between you and what you're doing and what you want to know. And it crosses over, it permeates your life and your interests and your own personal experiences. And I think that a lot of times that's lacking in scholarly work. And that I'm really intrigued by that fact and the way that you talk about your research and the way that you guys make history that I don't know about accessible. I love your podcast, and we can talk about that either now or later or whatever. But Impressions of America podcast, I think that's how I found you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We can talk about the podcast in a moment, but the gatekeeping of academia, I think, is a very important issue that is happening, especially right now. I won't get too political on your show, but I think
I'm happy.
Cool.
You can do
Okay.
whatever you want.
So I think that with a lot of presentations of history and what facts are in recent years, history has never been more important to get across to average people who want to know about the world around them. And the gatekeeping in academia and making it difficult to understand so that only a person of a certain educational level can access it, I think is just abhorrent. History, the reason we write and research history is to better our understanding of the present so that we may make a better future. In my opinion, at least. I don't think that studying history should ever be something that is flaunted as like higher class or whatever. I think that that's pretty abysmal to gatekeep knowledge that is important to our society, for individuals to be well educated on the issues that matter, both today and in the past, to make better decisions going forward. So I do study history that is very deeply personal to myself. That's one of the macro kind of concepts of my thesis now, is how is media subverted with a particular government message? How can Hollywood, specifically in this thesis, inject messages into allegedly non-political media? And I think that that's something that we need to explore in the modern world, of how are messages being presented? How are they being portrayed in ways that are unsuspecting to an audience, so that they walk away with a particular view in mind of what it means to be American? And that for me is a very political reason for me to be doing the work that I'm doing, because of recent years. But then I also have the personal connections of, I love Christmas films. I grew up with these films.
I love that part of it too. It's like so intense, and we're looking for all these
like
clues,
I love
and
Christmas.
I love Christmas.
but there's a way that we can interact with something that we love so much, and kind of dig through it to understand it even better. And I think the messages of this is how Hollywood can inject media can inject messages into media, and how do we interrogate certain media to understand the messages that are being pushed? I think that's a much easier pill to swallow with Christmas films as your case study. So I appreciate you saying that our episode, and from what I'm saying about my work, it seems accessible, because that's really a huge goal for me, is to not gatekeep at any point in my conveyance of information and history. So thank you.
Sure. Well, so I was thinking about going back to the messages in the movies, Hollywood. Now, do you think that the messages are purposeful, or Do you think that the whoever wrote the movie, the producers, whatever, or they're trying to please the government, how do you think those things got put in there? Are they more subconscious even to the people who create it?
So that's a big question in my work, is kind of how did this happen and why? And it's very difficult to know a lot of the time, because films, especially in that period, had hundreds of people working with them. And scripts would go through so many different iterations, and not every script writer is credited or in the production notes. So it's difficult to kind of pinpoint who and when and why. But a lot of the messaging, say with Macy's in Miracle on 34th Street, Macy's had a say over how they were depicted in the film. To use their images to film in the 34th Street Macy's in New York, they had a contract to make sure essentially that they were presented well, that it was kind of propaganda for the, or not propaganda, but advertisement, publicity for Macy's.
Yeah.
And that kind of influence on the film really promotes commercialism and consumerism in very positive ways. Macy's has a lot. R.H. Macy literally says that Macy's is the store with a heart in the film. And then in the press book materials for that film, there are instructions for department stores to reflect the goodwill policy that is used in the film, so that they can boost their profits on both advertising for the film and also using the film as an instruction manual. Because in the film, without getting too much into the plot, the store Santa Claus is telling shoppers to go to other stores that have better prices, and that in turn makes those customers more loyal to Macy's for their honesty. It makes this kind of personal connection with Macy's, that they were willing to send me to another store, so I owe them my customer loyalty. And the press book materials for the film are instructing department stores on how to do that exact thing to boost their profits and customer morale. So there are hints throughout the kind of production notes, the press book materials, interviews with directors and actors after the fact about their films that hint towards how these messages got put into the films.
Interesting. Wow. So you're really attacking it from all angles.
With the blacklist material and the anti-communism, this is one of my favorite topics. I think it's so fascinating. There was a pamphlet by Ayn Rand in 1947 for the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, the MPAPAI, that was a list of 13 things to not do in your films to keep them from being communist subversion. So there were things like don't idolize the common man, and don't smear financial institutions, don't smear political institutions, things that would make it more American and anti-communist.
Wow.
And in some of the films after that pamphlet was released, you can see some of those kind of ideas. The FBI used that pamphlet in 1947 to condemn It's a Wonderful Life as communist subversion. There's a literal FBI report about It's a Wonderful Life and how it's decidedly socialist in nature. It's just so interesting to see the ways these films were interpreted by government agencies that are saying this is decidedly socialist and therefore it is anti-American, when another viewer of It's a Wonderful Life, me, sees it as extremely capitalist and extremely American as well. So yeah, you can see how Hollywood's hands are kind of tied here, because art is subjective, especially film. Yeah. There are so many ways to read a film. And I'm reading these messages from the films or into the films but other people might disagree with how I read certain scenes. And that just makes it even more exciting because then we can have a discourse about it. So.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I'm anxious to see your work because I've not thought of it in those terms, but one of the questions I ask is where do we see this history in pop culture? So I kind of get into that, sort of. But I've never thought about it quite the way that you put it, about looking, basically, it's not how you said it, but it's how I took it, looking for the clues, what was going on and the common man. And, I think that moving forward, I might look at things a little bit, maybe look for the clues a little bit more, just based on this conversation. So thank you for that. Yeah, so let's talk about that podcast.
So Impressions of America is our podcast. We have a website, impressionsofamerica.com, and we're also on Twitter at USA Impressions. It's been such a blast doing the podcast. It's my co-hosts Simon and Toby had started the podcast a couple years ago and asked me to join just around a year ago now. So we're coming up on my anniversary of actually joining in March. But yeah, it's been absolutely brilliant. It's been a completely new experience for me to convey research and kind of code switch for different audiences and in how I present things. So it's so much fun to kind of explore different presentations of histories. And what we cover are histories of politics and culture and media in the latter 20th century for how they kind of influence the American lives in later 20th century and how that kind of influences today. Every few weeks, every other episode really, we do a politics episode about kind of modern day politics. On the other weeks, we do history episodes. We've covered all manner of things. We did a Reagan trilogy, which was very interesting, starting from his early life in Hollywood and moving through his presidency. We're currently doing a trilogy on Bill Clinton and his presidency and administration. As you mentioned, we did a Christmas episode, a Christmas special, talking about my research. So we really get into a whole manner of things that I really selfishly love because I couldn't justify spending the time researching these things while doing my PhD. But now it's a professional adventure, so I get to study whatever I want to study. And
yes, that's like this podcast for me.
Yeah, it's a way to justify the kind of research interest elsewhere.
Well, it's bringing your passion into your work. I think it's taken me a long time to get here, but I feel like I'm more there than I was a long time ago. I'm really impressed by the scope of your knowledge on different subjects and the things that you guys talk about. And, I don't know how it happened, but I listened to the episode about, one-term presidents, I think it was. That's how, and then you come on and you're like, well, I got to say this. I'm going to put it out there. Jimmy Carter was my favorite president. And you had me at that. Yes. Because I grew up in a very conservative house. I was trying to figure out what year was it? I was a kid. And I just remember my dad like yelling at the TV and all that. But I always liked Jimmy Carter. Like I knew my mind then. And, as time has gone on, I found out more reasons why, as a human being, just a decent human being, I loved him. And then I was like, that's when I got then we started talking on Twitter. And that's how that happened. And then I started listening to more of your episodes. And I'm really impressed with the scope of the knowledge of all of you. You all come with different kind of perspectives, which makes it interesting. And I love that you're like this American woman, and then you got the Scottish guy, and then you got the English guy. And the fact that they're so knowledgeable about, the United States, way more knowledgeable than I am. And it's a really interesting mix, and I really enjoy that. I definitely recommend the podcast, and definitely I'll link out to it. How did that happen? Like, how did you find these guys, or how did they find
Yeah.
you?
So I think Toby found my research profile on UCL on the website. And originally they had asked me to come on as a researcher and possibly as a co-host if I felt comfortable doing it. They didn't want to kind of force me to do anything. And it took a bit of time to kind of feel out what felt right. And then, yeah, we all just, I think we get along very well. Our conversations are very multifaceted. I never know what Toby or Simon are going to come out with, and they never know what I'm going to come out with. We discuss some of the points beforehand, but it's mostly a very kind of fresh and live conversation around these subjects. And I think that does come across a bit. Like with the Jimmy Carter reference, we have kind of running gags on the show. One of them is about how the guys really love Nixon, and Nixon is their favorite president. And when I said, I was genuinely like, you guys might be very upset when I say this, but Jimmy Carter is my favorite president.
He's like the antithesis of Nixon.
Yeah. And you can hear the kind of dead silence for a moment where they're like, oh. I'm like, yeah, I love Jimmy Carter. And then we had a really great conversation about it. So yeah, I think you get a lot of that kind of live energy from our conversations that we really enjoy. I really love doing the show with them. But yeah, I got an email one day from Toby asking if I would be interested in kind of helping them out with research, and then it has just kind of blossomed from there.
I'm grooving on it. I like it. That's great. Where do you live in London?
Camberwell. It's just south of Waterloo.
I lived on Gower Street, right around from the British Museum.
At UCL. Like that's UCL's campus is on Gower Street.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Right across the street from where I think Charles Darwin had an apartment with his wife.
Oh, that's so cool.
I live right the Janet Poole house.
Yeah, I know exactly where that is. Oh my God, that's so cool.
I lived there for 3 months. Yeah, I loved it. Oh,
Did you go to UCL?
No, I went to American school, university, but I did my research there because I was writing a work of historical fiction, and it takes place in 16th century, pretty much London, but in England. And so I was doing research. That was, it was great.
So cool.
I loved it. Yeah, I miss it. How long have you lived there?
3 and a bit years. I moved here in September 2017.
Have you been able to come home since COVID?
Not since COVID. No. I actually, 2 of my best friends from home were here in February last year. And we went to Rome, and we were going to go to Venice right as Venice was shut down for COVID for the first time. And we got one of the last flights out of Rome to come back to London before all of Italy shut down. And then
crap.
I had a conference in Portugal. So I had to go to Portugal as COVID was like happening. Nobody really knew what was going on. It was literally the first week of March last year. And I got one of the last flights out of Portugal back to London before Portugal shut down. I was very lucky with the travel kind of constraints there. So I haven't even tempted it to go back to the States.
I know we had reservations. We were coming to England for 3 weeks in May. We love England. Well, I'm jealous. I wish I was there.
I wake up every day and it's just a dream come true still. Even when I can't leave my flat and I'm just stuck here for 12 months at a time, it's just mind-blowing every day that I get to live here. It's seriously a dream. I love London.
Yeah, I do too. And history, the history.
Yes.
So much.
when people ask me what I do in London, like for fun, I'm like, I literally walk around and just look at architecture. Like just look up and it's amazing. Like you
Right. Like I remember when I discovered that piece of the Roman wall when you get off at Tower Hill. It was like, and there's a playground over there. And what's this? It's part of a Roman wall. It's like, oh my God, just all the layers of it. And the other thing I did is I got my mudlarking license because I'm obsessed. I want to go mudlarking on the Thames.
Oh,
you know what that is?
Like dredging.
Yeah, but you have to have a license.
Oh.
And so I got my license and I got the equipment and we were going to figuring out how I was going to get it there. And yeah, I was going to go mudlarking because, people find all kinds of stuff on the Thames. Roman coins, shards of Roman pottery, Tudor tiles, Tudor jewelry, all kinds of stuff.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, you can. You can. The thing is, though, is that I think as time is going on, more and more people are doing it. And eventually I think they might do something to try and protect the antiquity there. There's mudlarking YouTube videos that you can watch, and that's how I kind of got into it. So then we ended up doing, since I couldn't go, my nephew and my niece started metal detecting, which is kind of similar, but not the same when you're in Colorado, because like antiquity, there is no real antiquity here. It goes back maybe to the 1800s. What is it that you want the audience to know, the listeners to know about your particular favorite history?
I think the bottom line of why I am so interested in just everyday people's lives in the past is that there's a lot of time and space between the important things we do. Where when you look at someone like George Washington and you can rattle off the kind of checklist of he was in these battles, he was a farmer in his youth, he was in the French Indian War, whatever. There's a life between those events that is just as rich and just as important to history that deserves our attention. And I think in looking at that, you can look at your own life and realize that your life is not just the instances of achievements. It's living every day and experiencing the world around you, interacting with others, using escapist entertainment, the books you read, the films you watch, the comics you read, whatever. That's just as important to what makes you a person and makes your life a life that is lived. Equally as important as the achievements that you meet. And I think that again, or further, can really shift one's perspective on the importance of living your life. We look at the past, and in so much time travel media, it has this like butterfly effect of if you change one thing in the past, then it drastically alters the future. And I don't think enough people relate that to the present. That if you change just one thing in your own present, you could drastically alter your own future and the future of others. Because we have so much control over the narrative of our own lives. And I think that's really brought out from looking at the kind of negative space, the time when important things aren't happening in other people's lives in the past, that we can kind of get to that point of understanding the importance and revering the importance of the time that we spend not hurtling towards a goal, or the time spent working towards an achievement without it just being the achievement itself. Does that make sense?
Profound, very profound. Yeah, powerful. Thank you. Thinking of anything else to ask you. I feel like I've gotten so much out of this conversation. Now tell me the truth. Do Toby and Simon are kidding about Nixon being their favorite president,
yes.
right?
Yes. They are kidding. It is sarcasm.
In a way.
In a way.
for entertainment purposes, maybe. I don't know.
I think the character and person of Nixon is something that they might enjoy more. They're going to tell me if I'm wrong about this too. But I don't think that actually the policies are. I don't think Nixon is their favorite president.
Okay. Well, one of my earliest memories was sitting on my dad's lap. Like I said, my dad was a diehard Republican. And the only time he voted Democrat was for Kennedy because he was an Irish Catholic, my dad was Irish Catholic. And he regretted it. But I do remember sitting on his lap as a child watching the inauguration of Nixon. I had no idea what was going on. I just remembered how happy my dad was. And the first time I ever saw my dad cry ever in my life was the day that Nixon resigned.
Oh, wow.
And that's the house I grew up in. And yet when Jimmy Carter comes along, I was like, I like him. I like Rosalind's boots. I just remember her boots. They were just real people.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember him saying, I have lusted in my heart. I was like, yeah, dude, we all have.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I'm a big Carter fan. Yeah. He's great. He put solar panels on the White House. Come on.
I know. And what really excited me is we were having our dialogue, and I posted that picture of him and Roz on New Year's Eve. And I put that picture and I said, sigh, and that they actually liked it. His library liked it. That was like, oh my God. I was so stoked about that. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your history and everything. And I love what you're doing, and keep doing it. I'm really looking forward to your future work. Have you written a book?
Well, funny you should ask, actually. I have not published a book, but I have written a nonfiction book that I'm going to try and get published in the next couple years.
Interesting.
About my life.
A memoir?
Yes, kind of. Like an autobiography. Yeah. A lot about most of the things that we just talked about.
You are a busy woman. I do not know how you do all this and yet still struggle with your physical issues. Like, how do you accomplish all that? Like, it makes me exhausted just thinking about it.
I think I do it in spite of the pain. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know where it comes from. I do a lot of stuff though, and I think it's more helpful for me to have so many different things going on at once, because when I get tired or burn out from a project, I can turn to something else and still enjoy what I'm doing, because all of it is passion projects pretty much. So
yeah, right.
Just kind of fill it up.
If everything's a passion project, you're in good shape.
So
well, it was really great meeting you,
as well.
Vaughn.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll send those links to you and keep you in the loop. And
all right, thank you so much. I enjoyed this so much.
Me
and
too.
Best of luck with the doctors and all of your everything.
There you have it. Vaughn Joy, co-host of Impressions of America podcast. To find out more about Vaughn and the podcast, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great week.